Joining us today for our How to Review Your Vendor's Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Pandemic Plans webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hershey Long, Venminder's Senior Information Security Analyst. He will walk through how to analyze vendor business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plan documents in detail. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our How to Do Vendor Due Diligence Reviews, the Complete Breakdown ebook, our How to Analyze a Vendor's Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans ebook, our How to Review a Vendor's Pandemic Plan infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hershey. Hershey, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jessie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. I hope you find this information valuable to your organization. So in this session, we will review what to look for in business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. We'll review the consequences if these plans are not sufficient. We'll do an overview of testing exercises, provide some real-life examples, and close with some key takeaways. All right, so let's jump right into it. So why is reviewing these plans so important? Well, the COVID-19 pandemic really was an eye-opener as to why these documents are so important to have. A vendor with a faulty business continuity plan, or a BCP, disaster recovery plan, DRP, or pandemic plan can be a recipe for disaster for these 4 reasons. Unprepared vendor. This could lead to the vendor flying by the seat of their pants in order to resume uptime. It's not a comforting feeling when you're relying on them for your own operations to resume. Operational delays. This can mean your organization's operations are interfered with for longer than anticipated or longer than the downtime allotted for in your own BCP or DRP. Data loss. The vendor may lose and not be able to recover some of your organization's and customers' data. And then finally, reputational hit. Your organization's reputation could be at risk due to the vendor's failure to implement comprehensive, well-developed BCPs and DRPs. Your customers and even the media will think it's your organization who is prepared because they aren't going to see what happens behind the scenes. Now, to begin to review your vendor's business continuity plans, you need to review these key areas. Reviewing these areas provides assurance that your vendor is prepared for a disruption. See if they have any testing procedures in their BCP. See that there are copies of the BCP are held off-site in secure locations and they are available to all employees. Check to see if the BCP is reviewed, tested, and updated regularly, such as annually, semi-annually, or quarterly. And one more thing I'll add on here, it's not on the slide, but check to see if the BCP is updated after significant organizational changes, such as executives joining or leaving the company, any new locations, or new technologies. Check the results of any test, and if the test didn't go well, check to see if the vendor provide any remediation plans. See if senior management and board is involved as well, and if they've approved the plan. Check for any SLAs and contractual obligations, failover and backup locations, personnel loss and planning, relocation plans such as new buildings or any alternative locations where employees can continue to work, remote access availability, facility loss contingencies, pandemic contingencies, and then finally breach disruption notification procedures. Now, the key takeaway here is that your vendor's business continuity plans and their preparedness should meet or exceed your own plans. So the same goes for vendor disaster recovery plans, or DRP. You need to look at these key areas. Look to see if the DRP has a dedicated team or individual that's responsible for the maintenance of it. See if there's any failover in backup locations, technology recovery. You want to check for any recent testing and the results of the testing, and if there were any issues with the testing. If there were any issues, check to see if those issues have been resolved. Look for a notification process. Some DRPs will also have a pandemic plan included in it. Look for their backup procedures, personnel recovery to normal operations. Check to see if the business impact analysis, or BIA, has been conducted, and see how often it's performed, such as annually, semi-annually, or quarterly. Side note, a BIA can also be found in a business continuity plan. You want to also check to see if senior management or their board of directors has approved the plan. And then finally, check to see if there are defined recovery time objectives, or RTO, and defined recovery point objectives, or RPO. And for pandemic plans, be sure to look at these areas when reviewing. Preventative programs. Does a pandemic plan have any procedures to communicate with critical vendors when a pandemic plan is activated? Does it monitor outbreaks? Is there any plan to educate employees regarding pandemic and preventive measures? Document strategies. Is the pandemic plan consistent with the CDC? Is it consistent with local, state, and federal agencies? Is it even consistent with measures of the World Health Organization? Framework of facilities, systems, and procedures. How does the vendor sustain operations during a pandemic? You want to know that. Also, check to see if they have a remote access plans, meaning does it have plans for employees to work remotely during a pandemic? Test programs. You want to ensure that the pandemic plan is effective, so you want to see when the pandemic plan was last tested and how often it is tested, annually, semi-annually, or quarterly. And oversight. How often is the pandemic plan reviewed? Is it reviewed annually? Is it reviewed semi-annually, or quarterly, or even monthly?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization currently review business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans on all vendors? Yes, on all vendors. Just some vendors, only critical or high risk? No, or you're not sure? Hershey, you have some time now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, how can you determine a vendor to be critical or high risk as it relates to BC or DR?
That's a good question. So it really boils down to availability. You need to ask yourself, do you need that vendor to be able to provide uninterrupted service to you in order to successfully operate? If you need them to always or almost always be up and running in order to do business, or if a loss of their service would greatly impact your organization, then they are a critical vendor.
Thanks, Hershey. We have just about 30 seconds left on this open poll question, so please go ahead and get your responses in. And we're down to just about 15 seconds left on this open poll. We appreciate everyone's responses, as it's always interesting for us to see what everyone says. Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you will find our How to Do Vendor Due Diligence Reviews, the Complete Breakdown ebook. Pages 4 and 5 cover reviewing vendor business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You'll also find information on reviewing SOC reports and cybersecurity, making this resource very helpful. Okay, Hershey, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thanks, Jesse. So let's get started on reviewing the Vendor Business Continuity Plan, the BCP. A vendor BCP should address these areas: planning for loss of personnel, facilities, or services; planning with public entities such as emergency services, local and state disaster relief agencies; and also communicating with significant vendors, clients, employees, and the media. All right, so let's go over these 10 steps to review the vendor's business continuity plans. To start, you need to verify that the vendor has a formal BCP. You then need to determine if it meets or exceeds your organization's needs and covers the critical components that are needed to ensure your operations continue normally. You should ask yourself, if your vendor becomes unavailable, will your services be impacted? Will they operate normally? This is one of the risks of utilizing a third party. In many cases, what happens to them may happen to your organization. Next, review the vendor's strategy for addressing personnel loss. This is known as the vendor's succession plan. Make sure to look for cross-training, job rotation, staffing agencies, and more as mitigations. Now, cross-training involves teaching an employee another set of skills in order to perform job duties that they typically do not do. With job rotation or job swapping, as it's sometimes called, it involves moving employees periodically between roles for a certain period of time. And then staffing agencies are just responsible for really plugging in people to fulfill positions temporarily when needed. You should also be sure to note that social unrest may occur. We've seen this especially in the last few years, and this can cause unavailability of some personnel. When you need to determine if the BCP contains plans for pandemic contingencies or mass absenteeism following the Center for Disease Control guidelines. Mass absenteeism means that most or even all employees avoid work for a good reason. So how will the vendor continue to operate without key personnel? We will talk more about pandemic plans later, but it's important to point out here how it's in sync with business continuity. Be sure to check relocation plans. Confirm they are acceptable and verify the vendor has a secondary facility or remote work capabilities. This includes things like assets, equipment, building relocations, remote access strategy, contract third-party office space, and more. Ask yourself questions like, can other locations handle the load or the capacity? Is there office recovery space within another building, and is the secondary location always ready? Is it cold, warm, or hot configuration? Does it have some of the equipment needed, or is it ready for full operations? Next, review their breach or disruption notification policy to verify a clear communication plan is in place and that's adequate and aligns with the information security language that's in the contract between your organization and the vendor. This step is very important as it's confirming the timing of when the vendor will notify your organization of a breach or disruption. So you want to make sure it's acceptable and meets any requirements you have, including regulatory requirements. It is a common practice that SLAs include exact timeframes that a vendor is required to notify clients when a breach or disruption has occurred. Next, you're going to want to review the vendor's business impact analysis, or BIA, within the BCP, and that it matches your expectations. Now, the BIA is the process which forecasts what might happen if your organization experiences a business impacting event and gathers information needed to determine how you recover from those events. Your operations may be impacted by one of your vendors, and if they're experiencing a business impacting event, which, depending on their criticality to you, this may immediately impact your operations, or may have a delayed impact to your operations if the vendor doesn't resume normal operations quickly. And now the BIA is going to include measurements such as RTO, RPO, and MTD. So let's go over those. Now, the RTO, the recovery time objective, this is the amount of time it's expected to take to recover back to normal operations or at a predefined acceptable state. Determining the RTO is important for selecting appropriate technologies and strategies. When it's not feasible to meet an RTO, management should verify whether the RTO is even realistic, and they should initiate an action plan and milestones to document the situation and, when appropriate, plan for its mitigation. Management should consider interconnected RTOs for each business function to determine the total downtime caused by a disruption. Establishing realistic RTOs assists management in determining a critical path and hierarchy for recovery. For example, a process with a shorter RTO that is dependent on a process with a longer RTO may indicate a gap that should be analyzed further. Whether driven by customer expectations or technological advancement, previously established RTOs that were a few hours in duration may now require near real-time recovery. Therefore, it may be appropriate for management to evaluate currently acceptable RTOs. Now, RPO, the recovery point objective. Your RPO, this helps identify how much data may be lost if data needs to be recovered. Typically, this matches with your backup or replication frequency. It's critical to review and understand RPO because it will become very important if a computer, system, or network goes down. Next, the MTD, the maximum tolerable downtime. So MTDs specify the maximum period that the vendor can be down before their survival is at risk. Ask yourself how much data may be lost and how long will normal operations be impacted. This is what you'll be learning when reviewing RTOs and RPOs. Some vendors will have different objectives for different services and client tiers. So you should ask, how does this relate to your contracted SLA? Understand the vendor's testing procedures. Ensure the testing is at least annual. It asks to see the actual or redacted test results. Any testing results showing room for growth should be followed up on. Ensure that the testing was successful as well, or if there were any issues. If there were any issues, check to see if those issues have been mitigated. Also, analyze the frequency of ongoing maintenance of this plan. The BCP should be reviewed regularly, such as annually, semi-annually, or quarterly, as part of the vendor's routine policy maintenance. But it also should be updated when a significant change occurs in the vendor's organization, as I previously mentioned. Be sure to check the BCP to when it was last updated or revised as well. The BCP usually will have a revision history in the beginning or ending of the document. If available, check to see if the BCP is reviewed at the intervals that the vendor is stating. You'd be very surprised the number of times I've reviewed BCPs that state it was reviewed annually, but then I look at the revision history and it shows that it was last updated in 2019 or in 2020, which is more than 3 years ago. If you come across a situation like this, you may want to go back to your vendor and request a more current BCP. Have a qualified subject matter expert like a SME write up the analysis. This should be an experienced IT professional or someone with a related credential, such as an Associate Business Continuity Professional certificate, like ABCP, or a Certified Business Continuity Professional, CBCP. And finally, reach out to the vendor to discuss any findings and next steps. Keep the analysis handy and reference as needed. Now I'm going to send it back to Jesse.
Our second poll question of the day is, how often does your organization review your critical third parties' business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans? Annually, quarterly, monthly, not sure, or not applicable? First, we have another question here that we can go ahead and answer from the audience. And that question is, my experience has been that many vendors do not share the results of their testing. What do you suggest when the vendor does not share these test results?
Well, there should be documented evidence it was performed. Ideally, you want to see testing performed annually, and they should provide a summary of the test and the results. Many organizations won't share the details of the test, and that's okay. I mean, sometimes this information can be considered proprietary, but they should be able to provide documented evidence that it was performed and that issues were resolved or mitigated.
Thanks, Hershey. We have about 50 seconds left on this poll question, so please get those results in. If you have any issues or have any technical questions, please remember that you can use the help widget, or you can also submit those questions with any other questions you may have throughout the session in the Ask Question widget. We do capture each question through the whole session. We'll answer some during the live webcast, but those that we cannot get to, you will get an email after the webcast with that answer. We're down to about 15 seconds on the open poll question, so please go ahead and get those responses in. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to point out to your attention to the related content widget, where you can find our How to Analyze a Vendor's Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans ebook. This is a handy resource to have around when it's time to analyze your vendor's plans. I'll hand it back over to you, Hershey.
All right, so we've gone over the business continuity plan. So let's talk about the vendor's disaster recovery plan. The disaster recovery plan, or DRP, should address the following areas. First, procedures for disaster recovery personnel. Next, determining what constitutes as a disaster incident. Now, this will actually vary between vendors. For example, many organizations may state that a pandemic constitutes a disaster, and rightfully so. However, what if 90% of the vendor's employees already work remotely and a global pandemic does not impact their business operations? The vendor may not consider it a disaster. So really check to see what the vendor constitutes as a disaster and if it aligns with your organization's standards. Next, implementing the DRP in accordance with the BCP. Now, just to clarify here, a disaster recovery plan is mainly dealing with the recovery of the vendor's IT infrastructure, things such as IT hardware, servers, and networking equipment. This is different from business continuity planning, which includes provisions for people, processes, office buildings, and facilities. There could be a scenario when the BCP is activated and not the DRP. However, both plans should work together when needed. Next, coordinating with public entities as needed. This can include coordinating with local law enforcement, community colleges, public schools, libraries, etc. And then finally, resumption of normal operations. How long will it take to resume normal operations? See if the RTO and the RPO can actually be met. Okay, so where do we start? So first, you need to verify the vendor has a disaster recovery plan, or a DRP, in place that is readily available to staff in the event of a disaster and addresses data loss and system availability. How much data may be lost and how quickly availability is restored should be represented by RTO and RPO. Next, check whether criteria is defined and in place for declaring a disaster. Without defined internal communication and an incident management program, employees may not know when to formally declare a disaster, attempting to fix the business impacting event instead of communicating the issue to key stakeholders. Now, after that, you should verify that the DRP covers availability and potential loss of equipment, data, and data centers or server rooms. Does their plan fit your security and availability requirements? Look at how data is stored, the location, and the status of the recovery information system. Now, after that, you need to check if a secondary data center is readily available in the event of a disaster and ensure it's sufficiently geographically separated so that a regional impacting event won't affect the vendor's production and recovery sites simultaneously. And geographically separated or geographically diverse usually means at least 100 miles apart. Then you will review the configuration of the vendor's data center recovery locations to assess the adequacy of recovery capacity to meet your business needs. And I'm going to break these down just really quickly for us. So there's three of them. You could have a cold site, a warm site, or a hot site. Now, a cold site, this would be like an empty building or an empty data center without servers, network hardware, or backup data. So basically, it has nothing in it, but it probably has electricity on. A warm site, also known as active passive or active standby location, has the necessary servers, it has the network hardware, and backup data on site, and can be ready to be utilized with minimal preparation. So we're talking about maybe a couple of hours. Now, a hot site, which is also known as an active-active or a live location, has all necessary servers, network hardware, and backup data, and is ready to be utilized at any moment or is utilized in tandem with the primary site. Sometimes with these hot site configurations, what some vendors will have is they'll have two data centers, and if the primary data center fails, it'll automatically fill over to the secondary data center. Now, the configuration of your vendor's recovery data center or server room will be influenced by cost. A cold site is the least expensive, while a hot site is the most expensive. So if a vendor's recovery data center or server room is a cold or warm site, check to see if this configuration is acceptable for your organization in the event the vendor endures a disaster. Next, ensure that a clear communication plan is in place and verify their client notification process meets your requirements. When issues occur, communication can save a relationship. Verify that the vendor's notification timeline meets any requirements you have, including regulatory requirements. As I mentioned, this is commonly put in an SLA. Review critical IT functions outsourced to a third party and ensure communication plans exist with subcontractors, aka your fourth parties or your nth parties. Those are the vendor's third parties. You will want to understand the vendor's testing procedures. Ensure testing is at least annual and ask to see the actual or redacted test results. Any testing results showing room for growth should be followed up on. And as I mentioned with the BCP, see if there are any issues with the testing, and if there are any issues, see if those issues have been mitigated or if there's plans for mitigation. All right, next, analyze the frequency of ongoing maintenance of the DRP. Plans should be reviewed annually and after significant organization changes as part of the vendor's routine policy maintenance. And as I said previously with the BCP, also check their revision history or see when the document is dated for. If you see anything odd, such as it was, reviewed annually, and you see that the date of the last revision was, 3 years ago, like in 2019 or in 2020, feel free to go back to your vendor and request a updated DRP. Have a qualified SME write up the analysis. This should be an experienced IT professional or someone with a related credential, member of the ABCP or CBCP. And then, reach out to the vendor to discuss any findings and next steps. Keep the analysis handy and reference as needed.
Our next poll question is, who in your organization is responsible for reviewing your vendor's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans? Information security, a third-party risk management team, legal, accounting, procurement, we outsource to a third-party service provider, not sure, or not applicable. Hershey, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And this question is, what should we be reviewing in the disaster recovery plan?
Oh yeah, I can answer that for you. So you want to make sure you're reviewing the DR plan annually for things like evidence that is reviewed by the vendor and updated regularly, such as annually or quarterly or monthly. And you want to know who exactly is responsible for reviewing and updating the DR plan as well. Recovery locations, data center or server rooms. You want to look for disaster recovery site configurations such as cold, warm, or hot. You want to see if these data centers are geographically diverse, at least 100 miles apart. Look for regular testing and types of testing, such as tabletop, simulation, or full interruption. And also if they have on-site and off-site backup.
Thanks, Hershey. Just a reminder that this session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you would like to receive this credit, please remember that you must answer all of the poll questions that appear on your screen today, and you must be on the entire presentation time. We will be closing this poll in just about 10 seconds. Thank you. And here are those results. Thanks everyone for answering this question. Before we move on, I'd like to mention that we have our How to Review a Vendor's Pandemic Plan infographic in the related content widget. This infographic discusses what to look for in pandemic plans and next steps for you to consider. Let's continue with the presentation. Hershey, back to you.
All right, so we've covered VCPs and we've covered DRP. So now let's talk about pandemic plans. I know these have been a highlight for the past several years, so let's take a look at what they include. So what you should look for in a pandemic plan. A strong pandemic plan will include 5 major categories. Those are preventive programs, documented strategies, comprehensive framework of facilities, systems and procedures, testing programs, and oversight programs. So let's go ahead and break these down. Preventive programs, why are these even needed? So these programs reduce the likelihood that the vendor's operations will be significantly affected by a pandemic event. Now, these programs could include communicating and coordinating with critical service providers and suppliers, providing appropriate hygiene training and tools to employees, monitoring of potential outbreaks, and educating employees on pandemic events. The next one, documented strategies, how does this function? This provides for scaling the vendor's pandemic efforts so they are consistent with the effects of a particular stage of a pandemic outbreak, such as the 6 intervals described by the Center for Disease Control Prevention. And those 6 steps would be investigation, recognition, initiation, acceleration, deceleration, and preparation. Comprehensive framework of facilities, systems, and procedures. What does this look like? Well, this provides the vendor the capability to continue its critical operations in the event large numbers of the staff are unavailable for prolonged periods. So we're talking about mass absenteeism. Testing programs. So what does this do? This ensures that the vendor's pandemic planning practices and capabilities are effective and will allow critical operations to continue. So with testing programs, the pandemic plan should also be tested at least annually, much like the BCP and the DRP. Finally, we have oversight programs. What does this add up to? This ensures the vendor is performing ongoing review and updates to the pandemic plan so that policies, standards, and procedures include up-to-date relevant information at all times. Much like the BCP and DRP, this should be reviewed at least annually. Now, I know I previously mentioned these earlier, but let's get into some more detail on these steps to review the vendor's pandemic plan. So first, you need to verify your vendor has a pandemic plan. Determine whether a formal written plan exists, that it meets or exceeds your organization's needs and covers critical components that are needed to ensure operations will continue. The vendor's first order of priority should always be the safety and protection of its staff and other people. Next, the vendor should prioritize resuming their normal operations. You want to know that if the vendor becomes unavailable, that your services will continue to operate normally. Now next, you need to determine if the plan includes contingencies or mass absenteeism following the Center for Disease Control guidelines. Think about this. How will the vendor continue operations without their key personnel? If mass absenteeism occurs, can the vendor still operate normally, or will there be delays, or will operations be sluggish and slow? What happens if a vendor must shut down operations altogether? And if so, for how long? Is this going to be permanent? It's important to understand the processes your vendors have in place should the absolute worst case scenario occur. Next, you want to check their relocation plans. Confirm they're acceptable and verify the vendor has a secondary office facility or remote work capabilities. This includes things like assets, equipment, building relocations, remote access strategy, contract third-party office space, and more. If the vendor has neither a secondary office facility or remote work capability, this may be a red flag. Now, I say maybe because it all depends on the criticality of the vendor to your organization. If one of your critical or high-risk vendors does not have a secondary office facility or remote work option, that may be a huge concern to your organization's leadership, and they should know about that, and this may trigger a discussion with the vendor immediately. Now, when you're reviewing the vendor's pandemic plan, ask yourself some questions like the following. Can other locations even handle the load? If the workload is transferred to a secondary location, see if it seems feasible that the location can even handle that workload. Something like normal operations being conducted in a large facility and then suddenly you being transferred to a smaller facility should make you question the capability of that alternate location. Ask this, is there office recovery space within another building? You think it would make sense to have a recovery space in another building. However, some vendors may be a bit frugal and may have their recovery space within the same building as their normal operations, and this may not be appropriate if a pandemic is declared. Do they have established remote work policies and procedures, as I mentioned earlier? Having remote work policies is typical in a pandemic plan as it helps accomplish two things. It creates social distancing. It's a common measure in pandemic plans that helps improve the safety of employees. Remember, the priority is the safety of people and its employees. It also helps maintain business continuity as staff are able to resume operations outside the main facility. All right, now we all have those pesky vendors that don't want to provide information needed. This is often the case with business continuity and disaster recovery policies, procedures, and especially testing. In a lot of cases, this is not an immediate red flag. You don't necessarily want your vendor to just hand over everything without any type of discretion. So here are some tips on what to do in that case. So first, talk to your vendor. try to build some rapport with them. See if they really understand the context of your request and why you are requesting this information. Review the ask. Pare down to exactly what you need and be concise. If you don't need certain controls, maybe just not ask for them. Just tell them, the controls that you're really looking for. And this actually is going to roll into suggesting an alternative. Would they be willing to complete a questionnaire versus hand over sensitive documents? With a questionnaire, most of the questions are usually yes or no. Sometimes they might need to provide a little bit more information regarding testing, such as date and maybe type of testing and frequency of testing. But usually questionnaires are pretty straightforward. Also, review your contract. Does it contain a right to audit language in the contract? And if it does, you need to review this with your vendor and show them that they need to provide this information according to your contract. Now, always be sure to protect yourself in your vendor contracts. Yes, vendor business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans go all the way to the contract level. So make sure your vendor contracts include the following. You want to have accessibility to the vendor's BCM, the business continuity management, policies and procedures, PMP, and program. Make sure your organization can access these documents when needed. This could include having a hard copy or even having access to the vendor's shared drive that includes this information. Independent testing requirements. You may want to request or encourage that the vendor has testing performed by a third party. Frequency and availability of test results. Make sure to specify how often testing should occur. Use defined time increments such as annually, semi-annually, or quarterly. Also set a timeline of when testing results are able to be reviewed and when they should be available. Recovery times. Have defined recovery times such as recovery time objective, recovery point objective, and a maximum tolerable downtime. Backup responsibilities. State who are the backups in case key personnel are not available. This should include phone numbers or maybe even email addresses as well. Cyber resilience. You may want to mention what the risk acceptance, the risk mitigation, and or the risk transfer are. Management of third-party outsourced business continuity. And then finally, breach or disruption notification. Have a defined deadline when the vendor must notify your organization of a breach or disruption. All right, and so now let's do an overview of testing exercises. Testing helps identify gaps in plans and helps to continuously improve the ability to recover. So let's go over kind of the three types of testing that you usually see with business continuity and disaster recovery and pandemic plans. So first, there's tabletop exercises. These are also known as TTX or TTE. Tabletop exercises are a discussion-based only exercise where personnel with roles and responsibilities from different departments meet in a classroom setting or in breakout groups to validate the content of the plan by discussing their roles during an emergency and a response to a particular scenario. So basically, it's just several department heads usually just gather around a table and discussing a scenario and what they would do. Simulation drills. These are limited scale exercises or mock drills. This is where employees perform the exercises in their workstations, but with limited or no interruption to business operations. Then there's a full interruption test. This is a full-scale exercise when operations are shut down at the primary site and shifted to the recovery site. This also includes actual business disruptive events when the business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, or a pandemic plan have been activated. Now, full-scale exercises in themselves are inherently risky many times, depending on the configuration and technologies involved. Yet another reason that testing is so important. An organization will build up to a full-scale exercise after first performing tabletop exercises where required personnel walk through a theoretical business impacting event and the actions they take to mitigate and recover from that event. Next, an organization would perform, if it were a technology services software as a service vendor, for example, a failover to their secondary data center, but without transferring internet traffic to the failover system, only performing tests on the failover system to ensure it is a functional copy of the system. Then they will invite a small number of clients to participate in the following test or perform the test transferring internet traffic to the secondary facility during off-peak hours so that if there are issues, only a small subset of people are impacted. Now, tabletops are the simplest test to do. They are virtually risk-free to regular business operations, but also the least intense because no action or practice is involved. Full-scale or full interruption tests are much more intense as it demonstrates how efficient a business continuity or disaster recovery plan is, but it also interrupts regular business operations and it could be costly. Simulation exercises tend to be a good balance of tabletop exercises and full-scale exercises as it puts the plans into action without jeopardizing normal business operations. It is common that big organizations such as like the Fidelity or our IBM conduct simulation exercises. Now, consider this scenario. A large corporation like IBM wants to, test the BCP plans. They could utilize one or even all types of these exercises. So let's look at tabletop exercises, or the TTE. The department heads meet in the conference room and they discuss their actions if a tornado causes severe damage to their primary office facility and data center. They discuss responsibilities of key personnel, evacuation measures, failover to secondary data center, and work from home capability. If there will be any major business interruptions, and if so, how long will it take for operations to return to normal? Now, let's say they want to do a simulation exercise. So in this one, IBM wants to ensure its employees have all the necessary resources to work from home if a tornado destroys or damages the primary office. A subset of workers are directed to take their laptops home to test connectivity and ensure they have access to the necessary applications to perform their job duties. IBM also copies all necessary data and applications to the secondary data center and ensures it can be operational if needed. Other than maybe this organization wants to, conduct a full interruption or full-scale test. So this is what I consider like this is not a drill. So in this scenario, like a tornado has rendered the main office unsafe and has caused severe damage to the primary data center. All local employees are instructed to work from home and the production is transferred to the secondary data center. That secondary data center becomes fully operational within minutes and a small set of customers are impacted. And finally, some best practices to wrap up today. We covered a lot of information, and here are some recaps. Establish a process to follow when a vendor experiences a business impacting event. You need to communicate with your vendor and try to build that rapport and that trust up. Contractually commit the vendor to test their plans at least annually. Remember, tabletops are the easiest tests, but they're less intense. Full interruption tests are more intense but carry more risk. Simulations are a balance between tabletop and full interruption. Set clear expectations and notification requirements with the vendor. Make sure notification requirements align with your organization's notification requirements. Document your vendor BCP or DRP reviews and address the findings with the vendor. Regulators expect this. Ensure the vendor's documents are current, and if you see any red flags, discuss them with your vendor as soon as possible. Make sure your vendor's plan covers people, places, and pandemics. The most important aspect of BCPs, DRPs, and pandemic plans is the safety of people. And with that said, thank you for this presentation. I will go ahead and send it back to Jesse.
Great. Thanks so much, Hershey. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd also like to thank Hershey for his time in sharing some very important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars, our Creating an Effective Vendor Document Collection Process on June 27th, and our How to Classify Who is a Critical Vendor webinar on July 11th. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hershey, our next question is, can you monitor metrics at the vendor in lieu of obtaining and reviewing vendor pandemic plans?
Yeah, so some industries, such as the financial industry, are going to have regulations which outline pandemic planning should be reviewed, probably at least annually. Monitoring metrics related to performance of the vendor would work to mitigate much of the risk, but it doesn't hurt to know that a plan of some kind is in place, even if it's not required by a particular regulation.
Great. Our next question. What should you be doing with BCM planning with fourth parties? What are best practices? And what, if any, are regulatory expectations for fourth party oversight related to their planning?
Oh, yeah, fourth parties. Everybody loves fourth parties. So this will depend on the inherent risk and criticality of the fourth party to your third party. So if it's a data center or a cloud service provider, for example, they would be critical to the delivery of services by the third party. So they really should be reviewed as if they were a third party. And the same due diligence that you would put on your third party should also be applied to that fourth party or nth party.
Perfect. Our next question is, what if my vendor won't give me documentation on their most recent disaster recovery test?
Yeah, so there should be documented evidence that a disaster recovery test was performed. Ideally, you would want to see testing performed at least annually, and the vendor should provide a summary of the test and results. Actually, it's not uncommon that organizations won't share the details of the test, and that's okay because they should be able to provide some type of document and evidence that it was performed and that issues were resolved. So you may want to ask for maybe a redacted testing document, or maybe ask them to fill out a questionnaire that answers those questions that you need answered.
Great. On to our next question. How do vendors perform the test for their business continuity and disaster recovery plans?
Yeah, so you should be receiving some evidence that the vendor tested their plan, as I mentioned earlier. So business continuity and disaster recovery testing evidence should include things like whether the test has been tested annually. If that's what they say. If they say it's done annually, then you should have something that was done in the last year. We look at things that are done in the last 18 months. You should also be able to determine the type of testing that was performed. So as I discussed in the webinar, a tabletop test is a verbal walkthrough of the plan given a theoretical event. Simulations or simulation drills, that's an exercise where certain BCP or DRP activities or functions are carried out in a way that does not impact or change normal operations. So a great example of this or simulation test would be like an evacuation drill that would fall under BC testing, or server room failover. That would be an example of a simulated DRP test. And then the full interruption or the full scale test is a full test or failover where operations are completely shut down at the primary facility and production is moved to another location. So you should also see that there's evidence that the test was completed successfully or that identified issues have been addressed or are being addressed.
Great. Our next question. Who should be reviewing a business continuity and disaster recovery plans within the organization? What is or should be the business's role in this?
So on the business continuity and disaster recovery side of due diligence, you'll want someone with really good, like, demonstrable knowledge across information security and the BC and DR to perform the review. So you'll want someone with, probably experience that doesn't turn into some type of mindless checkbox activity. You want someone that really knows what to look for. So that's unlikely to be your third-party risk manager directly, but rather a supporting resource from your internal information security team. So this could be someone like an IT manager, a senior information security analyst, a business continuity coordinator, or even like a business continuity steering committee, or even an IT steering committee. If these resources aren't available within your organization, you'll need to look to a third-party risk management service provider for assistance.
Great. Next question. Do you recommend performing tabletop exercises with critical or high-risk vendors?
Yeah, if they allow you to participate and you have the bandwidth, I would say yes. Tabletop exercises are, like I said, they're verbal walkthroughs of the plan given a theoretical event. So this can be a fun activity. You're discussing different scenarios and how your vendor tends to respond to these scenarios. If your organization is able to participate, this would be a great opportunity to ask questions and to get a better understanding of their recovery measures, and perhaps build confidence in the vendor's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. It may help build rapport with your vendor as well.
Perfect. And our next question. How likely will the larger vendors like AWS, GCP, and ServiceNow provide these details on their internal operations?
Yeah, a lot of times the larger corporations, such as the AWS and the GCPs of the world, they're more prepared to provide their materials or at least adequate summaries. They tend to be more accustomed to request and have a standard package. That being said, sometimes that package is very generic or it could be very vague, so you may have to dig a little bit deeper and work with your representative to get what you need. This is where being prepared with exactly what you want can come in handy.
Great. Next question. In performing our due diligence, the business continuity plan and exercise results are documents that vendors frequently consider confidential and are unwilling to share. As an alternative, can we rely on SOC report test results to note that the vendor has a BC plan and performs an annual DR test?
It certainly is not usual for vendors to be hesitant on sharing their internal documents, as many of these are considered proprietary and confidential. SOC reports, or specifically SOC 2 Type 2 reports, may have quite a bit of information on BC and DR plans. However, this will depend on the vendor, and it's also really going to depend on you as the organization are looking for. So most SOC 2 Type 2 reports have information such as if the vendor has a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan in place, probably how often it's reviewed and updated, and how often it's tested. It also may contain data center location information, office facility locations, and information regarding backups. However, if you need more details regarding their BC, their DR, and their pandemic plans, and they are unwilling to provide those things, they're willing to fill out a questionnaire. I mean, on the questionnaire, most of the questions are really yes or no response. So you can at least determine whether they have certain controls in place or not.
Thanks, Hershey. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you again, Hershey, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We'd like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of Endminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.